Alright, what's going on everyone? In this video we'll be building this modern card that you're seeing here on the screen that has some pretty cool effects and animations. Now if we hover over the card here, you'll see some of those effects and animations. So the first thing is we're going to have some content here coming from the bottom of the page, which in our case is going to be the social media icons, and then we have a learn more button here. Alright, now what we're also doing is when we hover over the card, we are going to scale this card to get slightly bigger to make it look like it's coming at us, and then we're also going to add a background blur to the image here. Alright, so it makes the content a little bit more visible. Now, to create this card, we'll just be using some basic HTML and CSS. So if you are new to HTML and CSS, this will be the perfect project for you, and if you already have some experience, stick around as you may learn something new. Now, the one thing is when we create a card like this that has some animations, we want to take into consideration mobile devices. All right, so what we're also going to do with this card is we're going to create a mobile fallback here. So if I inspect this here, and what we can do is change this to mobile, and what you can see is going to happen here is we're going to have a fallback, and we're just going to display all the card information here at once. All right, so that's what we're going to be building, so let's get started. Now, if you'd like to follow along with me during this video, I've created a GitHub repository for this modern card that contains the completed version of this card, but I also have a branch that has the starting files at which we're going to begin this video at. So if you head down below to the description, you should see a link for the repository, and it should take you to this page right here. Now, by default, it's going to take you to the main branch, which has the completed version. Now, if you want the starting files, what you're going to want to do is there's a drop-down menu here where we can see main, and we want to click on part 1 here. Now once you have this selected, we can come over here to this code button, and then you can download the zip and then open up the files in the text editor of your choice. Alright, so here in VS Code, I have opened the starting files repository, and inside of this repo, we have an assets folder which contains 2 images, which we'll be using for this card. Then we also have our HTML file and then our style sheet here. Now on the left hand side, what you're seeing is I opened up our HTML file with a plugin or an extension within VS Code called Live Server. Now if you're unfamiliar with what Live Server is, it allows us to make changes to our HTML and our style sheet, and it updates here in the browser in real time, so we don't need to do any refreshing as we make updates to our HTML file or our style sheet, so that's pretty cool. Now, as you can see, this looks pretty bad because we haven't applied any styling to it, so we'll go ahead and address that later on within this video. Now, to begin, what I want to do first off is just take you through the starting files here, beginning with our HTML file. So let's begin here at the top with our head tag. So it's pretty simple. We just have a basic title tag here. Then we're linking up our style sheet. And we also have this additional link tag here, which is referencing the Font Awesome library, which we will be using those icons down here within our markup. Alright, so for our markup, we have inside of the body tag this initial div right here, which is wrapping everything with a class of card wrap. Now inside of this div, we have another div with a class of card, which is going to be for the card itself. Alright, and what we're doing here is we're applying an inline style for the background image, and at the end of the video or near the end, I'll explain why we are doing this approach and not actually adding the background image to the actual class of card itself within our style sheet. So we'll get to that a little bit later on. Now within this div, we actually have the card content. So for this video and tutorial, we are gearing this card towards a profile type of card. Now you don't need to do that. You can add anything you want inside of this card, but it just so happens for this video, we're going to be doing a profile card. All right, so we have an H2 here with the class of card title. Then we have a paragraph tag here with the class of card subtitle. And then below that, we have a div with a class of socials, which is going to have all of the icons for the social media. You can see Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And then at the end here, we just have our button. Now for the style sheet, I didn't add much to begin with. So let's start at the top, and we just have a simple variable here called primary, which is going to be for our primary color that we're going to be using throughout our card here. Alright, now below this, we are going to be importing a font from Google, and that's going to be called Monostrad. Alright, now below this we're doing a simple reset here, and what that includes is we're setting the margin to 0, the padding to 0, and we're setting the box size into border box, and then we're going to set our font family from Google, which was called Monostrad. And just to go ahead and center everything into the page here, as you're seeing on the left hand side, how I'm doing this is we're setting the height to 100 VH. We have the display set to flex, and then to push it all to the center, we are using the align items and justify content, and we're setting that to center. Alright, so let's begin to style out our card here, and we're going to do this in 3 different parts. So the first part is going to be the basic styling of our card. Now the second part will be us adding the effects and animations to the card, and the third part will be for the mobile fallback. Alright, so let's start off by targeting our card here, and let me scroll down a little bit here. So the first thing we're going to do is add some padding to the top, and we're going to say 18 rem here, okay? And that's going to give our card some height. Now the next thing we want to do is add some width, and we'll say 300 pixels. All right. Now what we also want to do is I want to add the position relative here, and you'll see why in a few moments. Now if we head over to our HTML file here, you can see on this div with the class of card, we are setting inline the background image here, and currently you can see this doesn't look so great. So let's fix that. We want to add a few properties here for the background. So the first one's going to be the background position, and we will set this to the center here. That's going to bring the image into the center. Now the next thing we want to do is the background repeat, and we're going to set that to no repeat. And then finally for the background size, we want this to cover, and that's going to make it look like this, and already it's looking a lot better. Okay, and we also want to add a color property here, and we're going to set this to white. And then lastly, the overflow, we want to set this to hidden here. All right, and that should do it for our card. Now the image currently isn't very light, but I do want to show you and make this, kind of dynamic to where if you did have a lighter image, we can, make it pop a little bit still with the text, and we can do that using an overlay. And how we're going to create an overlay is we're going to target our card, and we're going to use the after selector here. And this is why we positioned our card relative, because we're going to position the content here in the after selector absolute to this. Okay, so let's start out by saying position absolute, and we're going to say top 0, and we need to add a content property here and say an empty string. Okay, and then let's add a background color here. We're going to be using black, so we'll say background and color, and we'll do an RGBA value, and we'll say 0, 0, 0 for black, and then for the alpha value we're going to pass 0.3, or that would equate to 30%. Alright, so currently we don't see anything here, and that's because we haven't defined a width or a height. So if we say width and do 100%, and then we define a height here and do 100%, now you can see we have our overlay, and we can get a little more explicit if you can't see this, because I don't know if it's very visible on YouTube here. So let me just say 8 here, and then you should see that kind of what we did here. But let's add this, or put this back to 3. Now, the one problem we have is you can see that currently the overlay is on top of our text, which isn't good. Let's go ahead and fix that here. So what we want to do is target our card content, and what we want to do is position this relative, and if we just do that, nothing happens. But what we can do is pass it the Z index property, and we can bring it to the front by passing it a higher Z index, which in our case, if we pass it 2, it should bring it to the front here, which it does here. So what it's doing, it is bringing it to the very front of everything here that's layered on top of the card itself. So the after here has a Z index of 1, and so does a card itself. So if we were to pass, Z index of 3 here, it's going to go back over the top of this because it has a higher Z index value. So hopefully that makes sense, but we don't want that, so I'm going to remove that here. And then lastly here on the card content, we just want to add the padding around all sides, and we'll say 10 pixels like that. Now next we're going to start to target the content within our card content, starting with our card title. So let's target our card title here, and all we're going to do inside of here is just apply a margin on the bottom of 8 pixels, and what that'll do is give us some separation here between our title and our subtitle. Alright, now next up let's target our subtitle. And inside of here, what we want to do is first off reduce the font size from 16 pixels, which is what it is by default, to 14 pixels. And then we'll apply a margin bottom once again, and we'll do 16 pixels like that, just to give it some more separation between our subtitle here and our icons. Alright, now if we go over to our HTML file here, our icons are being wrapped in this div with a class of social. So let's copy that and target that here within our style sheet. And we'll first off start by displaying this as flex. Okay, so Right away when we do that, the spacing that's in between each one of these flex items is now gone. So we want to add some space in between these to separate them, and there's a few ways you could do this. So if we head over to our HTML file here, you can see inside of our div of the class of socials, we have 3 flex children here. So a older approach is you could target the S icon here and then apply a margin right, and then you could specify another selector on the last child to remove that margin. But there's a way more easier way to do this now, and before we do that, I realized I don't have an href value on here for these anchor tags, so let's just add that and specify an empty or a pound sign for now, and if you want to update this, you can do that. Alright, so a way more easier approach to add some spacing in between your flex items is with a property called column gap here. And if you want to learn more about gap, I have a video that I'll link above in a card that I go way more in depth on how this works. Okay, but as you can see here, if I specify the column gap and set it to 8 pixels, we're now going to have 8 pixels worth of space in between each one of our flex items. Okay, and then lastly here on our socials div, let's apply a margin on the bottom to add some separation here between our icons and our learn more button. So let's begin to style out each one of our icons here. So if we head over to our HTML file, you can see that each one of our icons have this class of S icons. So let's target that here within our style sheet. So we'll say S icon here, and we're going to add some properties. So the first one we're going to do is a cursor of a pointer. We want to display this as flex, and we're going to justify the content to the center, and we're also going to align the items to the center, and we'll apply a background color here of white. Now if we save this, you can see that you may be wondering, why did we apply justify content and align items to the center? It hasn't done anything. Now if we add a width here, and we'll say 37 pixels, and we'll do a height of 37 pixels, what it's going to do is push the icons into the center. So if I did comment this out here, you can see that now the icons will be in the top left hand corner, which we don't want. So that's what justify content and align items center is doing for us here within our icon. Okay, now next up what we want to do is we're going to get rid of this underline here. So we'll say text decoration and set that to none, and that'll remove the line underneath the icon. And then we want to round these, so we'll specify a border radius, and we'll set it to 50%, and that'll round these. Now we are going to be adding a hover effect to these icons, so what we'll do is we're going to add a transition here of 300 milliseconds ease, and we'll do all, and that'll make the transition when we hover over it smooth and happen over a duration of 300 milliseconds. Okay. Now, next up, what I want to do is actually target the icon itself and make some adjustments. So if we go to our HTML file here, you can see that actually each icon is in this I tag, so we can target that. So what we'll do is say S icon and then target our I tag. And what we want to do here is we're going to give it a font size of 20 pixels, and that'll increase the icon, you can see here, to be a little bit larger. Okay. And then for the color here, we'll say RGB. And what we'll do is we'll target, let's remove all these default values here, our primary color inside of our root. So we'll say var, and then we'll do primary like that. And as you can see now, our icons are the primary color that we have specified here inside of our root. Okay, so that's good. And then what we also want to do here is we're going to be animating the color of the actual icon color itself. So we'll add a transition here to this as well. All right, so there we go. So what we want to do is we'll target the S icon in its hover state here. And what we'll do is we're going to change the background color here, and we'll say RGB again. And we want to change it to our primary color here. So we'll just say var, and we'll do our primary here. So if we hover over this now, you can see that the color is going to change to that blue. Okay, but now we have a problem where the icon itself is not visible, so we need to target the actual icon itself in its hover state. So what we'll do is we'll say S icon hover, and then we'll target our I tag or our icon, and we'll change the color to be white, just like that. Okay, so we hover over these now, you can see that the icon is going to be visible once we hover over it. So that looks good. So the final thing that we need to style here is going to be our button. So if we head over to our HTML file, you can see our button is an anchor tag that has the class of card BTN. So let's target our card BTN here inside of our style sheet. And let's first start off by setting a display here, and we're going to set this to inline block. Okay. Next up, we want to add a transition here of 300 milliseconds ease in all, because we are going to be having a hover effect on our button. Next up, let's set the background color here, which we're going to use our RGB and the var of primary here for the background color, which is going to be that blue. Next up, we want to set the color here of the text to white. And since this is an anchor tag, we don't want that line underneath the text. So to remove that, we'll just set a text decoration here and set that to none. That'll remove that. And I think the font size for the button's a little bit too large here, so let's reduce that to 12 pixels. And we also want to set the border here to none. Okay. Now what we're also going to do is we're going to round the corners of our button just a little bit, so we'll do a border radius of 6 pixels on all sides. Now, the one issue is we don't have much space between our button, and it looks really bad right now. So one easy way to fix this is let's add some padding to the top, bottom, left, and right. So we'll do 8 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 16 pixels on the left and right. And there we go. That looks a lot better. Now, the final thing that we need to do here is just add a simple hover effect to our button, and when we hover over it, all we're going to do is change the background color. So let's go ahead and target our card button in the hover state here, and then we'll target the background color. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to lighten the primary color that we have here inside of our root. Now what I'm going to do here is we've been passing, or what we've been doing for the background color is we've been specifying RGB and then our var primary here, but what we can actually do is we can say RGB and still our primary color, but we can also tack on the alpha value here, and what I want to do is set this to 60%, which would be 0.6. So now when I hover over it, it's going to be the background color of our primary, but at a 60% opacity. As you can see, when we hover over that, you can see that in effect right here. Alright, so we finished up the styling on our card. Now the next thing we're going to do is implement the effects and animations, and we're going to begin with animating in and out our card content here. So the idea is when we are not hovered into the card, we only want to see the title and the subtitle, and then when we hover in, we want to see the additional items here, such as our social icons and our Learn More button. So what we want to do is we want to position the card content so that we only see the subtitle and the title here by default. So what we'll do is on our card content class, we want to specify the transform property here, and we're going to say translate Y. Now, if you update the content and you don't make it exactly like I have it here, you may need to mess with this value, but what I found works perfect for what we have here within our card is if we specify 55%, and what it's going to do is it's only going to show us the title here and the subtitle, and everything else is actually underneath here. And we can see that if we go back up to our card here and we have this overflow of hidden, if I disable that, you can see that the card content is currently right here, but since we have it set to hidden, we aren't going to see that, which is what we want. Okay, so now for us to actually see this when we hover in, we need to define a hover effect on our card, and then we want to update this transform here on the card content itself. So what I'll do is right here above card, the card after selector, we'll specify a card, and we're going to listen for the hover effect here, and then we want to target our card content. Okay, now what we want to do here is we want to specify the transform property again, translate Y, and set that back to 0 or its initial state. So now when I hover over it, you can see that it's going to come in and out. But currently it's very abrupt, so what we want to do is add a transition on here. So back on our card content, we can say transition, and what I found worked the best was 500 milliseconds, or half a second. We'll do ease, and we'll set this to all. So now if we save this and we hover over it, you can see it's going to come in nice and smooth. Now when we hover over the card, what we also want to have happen is you want the card to scale just a little bit to make it look like it's coming at us. And to do this, all we want to do is we'll come up here where we define our card hover on the card content, and we'll just say card, and we'll target the hover. And all we want to do is we're going to pass the transform again, but this time we're going to say scale, and the default is 1 for this, so we're not going to do a crazy amount of scaling here. So all we're going to do is 1.01, which is just slightly above the normal. So if we hover over this now, you can see that it's going to scale in. But as you can see, that's very abrupt and it doesn't really look smooth like we had in the demo. So what we want to do is on our card itself, we want to add a transition here as well, and we'll do 500 milliseconds ease, and we'll set this to all. And now if we save that, this should happen very smoothly. And we can get very explicit with this, and I can kind of show you what it does on a larger scale. So let's say we want to scale it by 1.5, which I don't think you should ever do, but as you can see here, what's going to happen is it's going to get really big like that, which I think is a little extreme. And I think just adding a slight scale here of pretty much just 0.1 to it does add a really cool effect once you hover over it. Alright, so for the last effect, what we're going to do is once we hover over the card, we're going to add a blur to our background image. Okay, now I also do want to mention at the time I recorded this video, the property that we're going to use to blur our background image is not yet supported on Firefox. So what I'll do is I'll show you an alternative to what you can do instead of adding a background blur to our image here on hover. Alright, so how we're going to achieve the blur on our background image here is we want to add the blur here to our overlay. Okay, so what we're going to do is we want to target the card on the hover state, and we want to target our after selector here. And it's actually very simple to add the background blur. We're going to use the property of background filter here, and we're going to use the blur method here. And what I found worked the best was 2 pixels for the blur. So if we hover over our card here, what you're going to see happen is we're going to have this blur on our background image, which is actually being applied to our overlay here. Okay, so if we want to get a lot more explicit with this, we can define something like 20 pixels here, which is really extreme, and obviously you're not going to be able to see any part of the image, which I don't recommend. So we're going to stick and use 2 pixels here. But the one issue is, as we've had with all of our effects and animations here, is that it doesn't happen very smoothly. So what we want to do is on our card and the after selector here, we want to add the transition, or not transform, we're going to say transition here. We'll say 500 milliseconds ease, and we'll do all. And now if we hover over the card, we should see that blur effect happen a lot more smoothly. So like I mentioned, the backdrop filter property is not yet available on Firefox. So as an alternative for Firefox, what you could do is instead of adding the backdrop filter and adding a blur, we could just darken the overlay that we have currently on top of our image. So let's remove the backdrop filter here, and instead of specifying a 30% opacity, what we could do is specify something like a 50 or 60%, and you could play with this if you want. But now if we hover over this, what's going to happen is it's going to get slightly darker, and it's going to make the content that's over the top of it a little bit easier to read. So I think this is definitely a great alternative if you're using Firefox or you want to account for Firefox and you don't want to add the blur. You can just darken the overlay that's currently on the after selector here. Alright, so the final thing that we're going to implement is our mobile fallback, because on mobile we don't have access to, the hover as we do here on desktop. And I think it's very important when creating something that has all these cool effects and animations to also account for a mobile device, because that makes up a big portion of the web nowadays. Okay, so how we're going to achieve our mobile fallback is going to be with a media query here, and instead of looking for a specific viewport like you think we might do, we can actually pass in here hover, and what it's going to do is detect whether or not we have hover on that current device that the user is viewing this card on. Okay, so all we need to do then is anywhere that we have, hover effects, you want to put them inside of this media query so that they only happen if hover is available on the device. So we'll copy and paste these in here like this. Now, one thing we also need to do is, because we wouldn't want this to be translated down below if they're on a device that doesn't have hover. So we need to copy and cut this out of here and then create the selector here inside of our media query. So we'll just say card content, and then we'll paste this in here like that. And then there's a few other spots we can grab some things that have hover. So for example, we wouldn't want our icon to have any hover state if hover is not available. So we can remove that here and throw them in our media query. So let's scroll back up here and paste it in here. And then the final thing we can add in here is going to be our hoverable buttons. So we'll go ahead and grab this from the bottom here. and we'll copy that, and then we'll paste it inside of our media query here, and that's going to be our mobile fallback. So now if we expand this browser here and we go to our Chrome DevTools, so as you can see right now we're on desktop, so everything should work. But on our Chrome DevTools we can select the device that we're on, so we can do a mobile device here, and what you're going to see happen is it's going to be back to our initial state because our project here is looking for the property of hover, and right now since we're on mobile we don't have it, so we're going to have our fallback here, which I think works pretty good. Now you can go ahead and do some adjustments to here, but I just wanted to show you how we can account for a mobile fallback. So if we change this back to desktop, you can see that once we start to hover back over our card, we have all of our cool effects and animations. Okay, so before we wrap up this video, like I mentioned, I wanted to explain why we were using an inline style here for our background image. And the reason is, say for example, we wanted to have two cards here. So let's just copy and duplicate this down. So obviously things don't look too good. So what we could do here is we could target our card wrap here, and we could set it to display flex. And we'll do flex direction column because we're on such a small screen. And let's do we'll do a row gap here, if I can spell, and we'll just say 16 pixels to add some separation here. Okay, so say we have two cards. If we were doing the style for the background image directly on this card selector here inside of our style sheet, then we couldn't have a card with a different background image. So now, for example, on the second card here, if we go into our assets folder, we have another image. I believe I'm using the second one here. If I remove the -2 here, we can now use a different background image on here, so we can make this card dynamic, and that's the reason why we're doing an inline style here for the background image on our card. Alright, so that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you guys did enjoy and learn something new, please be sure to leave a like on it down below, and if you are new to my channel, consider subscribing for more content like this, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.